What if the most unsettling events in our lives are not the loud ones, but the quiet interruptions we almost dismiss? A phone ringing at the wrong moment, a note tucked where no note should be, a message that arrives without a sender, carrying the strange weight of perfect timing. Most of us move past such moments. We call them coincidence because the alternative feels too vast, too intimate, too hard to hold in the mind for very long. This story begins there, in the narrow space between explanation and wonder. Not with proof of some grand design, and not with the certainty of hidden forces controlling every human step, but with a series of deeply personal events that seem to know more than they should. Across different cities, different professions, and different lives, people began to encounter warnings, guidance, and interventions that arrived just before trouble appeared. A crash avoided, a diagnosis made in time, a system failure prevented, a life quietly redirected. At first, each event seemed small enough to file away under luck. But luck has a texture. It is rough around the edges. It misses as often as it lands. What these people described felt different. The messages were too precise, too intimate, too aware of private fears, routines, and decisions never spoken aloud. Again and again, something appeared to meet them at the exact point where uncertainty turned into consequence. And so the larger question emerges, not as accusation, but as reflection. How much of human life is truly private, and how much of it is patterned in ways we do not fully understand? We live surrounded by signals, networks, predictions, and systems that know us better each year. Yet beyond the machinery, we recognize lies another possibility, quieter and more haunting. That sometimes guidance enters our lives wearing the face of coincidence. To follow these stories is not to surrender to paranoia. It is to sit honestly with a mystery. Because whether these moments reveal surveillance, intuition, hidden connections, or something more human and unknowable, they force us to confront an old and difficult truth. We are never as alone inside our lives as we imagine. What if the first sign was nothing more than a ringtone in traffic? In March of 2018, David Morrison was driving toward a meeting he believed could decide the fate of his company. The morning had the usual texture of urgency, brake lights flickering ahead, coffee cooling in the cup holder, a mind crowded with numbers and consequences. Then his phone lit up with a number that looked familiar and wrong at the same time. Local in appearance, impossible in its details. On the other end was a calm male voice, telling him to leave his usual route immediately. There had been an accident ahead, the caller said, and if Morrison stayed the course, he would lose far more than time. At first, he did what most of us would do. He doubted it. A stranger's warning, delivered without context, felt less like help than intrusion. But minutes later, the road closed around a fresh collision exactly where the voice had said it would be. Twisted metal, flashing lights. The fragile choreography of chance suddenly broken open. Morrison turned away, arrived by another route, and made the meeting that kept his business alive. After that, the calls did not stop. They returned in intervals that were irregular yet unnervingly exact, always landing at the narrowest margin between risk and consequence. A warning before a market convulsion. A quiet instruction to leave a building before a gas leak was discovered. Information about a client's hidden history before trust became damage. The voice never wasted words. It arrived, offered what was needed, and vanished. What unsettled Morrison most was not simply the accuracy. It was the intimacy. The caller seemed to understand his private hesitation before he had spoken it aloud, as though his fears, instincts, and unfinished decisions had become visible to someone else. By the time he tried to trace the numbers, they led nowhere. Not to a carrier, not to a switchboard, not even to the ordinary architecture of communication. And that is where the story deepens, because a warning can feel like grace until it begins to resemble observation. At what point does protection stop feeling merciful and start feeling personal in a way that unsettles the soul? Perhaps the real mystery was never the voice itself, but the silent distance between being saved and being known too well. What if the next clue did not arrive through a device, but by hand? Thousands of miles away, in a quiet neighborhood in Lisbon, Maria Santos found an envelope resting on her doorstep with no stamp, no return address, and no sign of who had placed it there. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The message was brief, almost tender in its restraint. Do not let your brother take the coastal road tomorrow morning. Nothing more. No explanation. No demand. Just a warning written with the confidence of someone who expected to be obeyed. Maria read it once, then again, her pulse changing in small, disobedient ways. Her brother, Thomas, had said only the night before that he planned to drive north at dawn for work. It was an ordinary plan, the kind of detail families mention without meaning. She had told no one else. Still, the note seemed to know, and so she did what people do when reason and fear meet at the same table. She called him, tried to sound casual, then urgent, then nearly pleading. He laughed at first, but family has its own gravity. In the end, he changed his route to quiet her concern. The next day, a landslide tore across the very road he had planned to take. In the hours that followed, relief did not arrive cleanly. It came braided with confusion. Santos could not stop turning over the same questions. Who knew her brother's plans? Who could have delivered the message unseen? Why warn them at all? When she checked with neighbors, no one had noticed a visitor. No camera caught a figure at the gate. It was as if the envelope had passed into the world without leaving a shadow. Then, weeks later, another note appeared. Different paper, same economy of language. This time it concerned her own health, urging her to schedule a medical exam she had postponed for months. The test revealed a condition in its earliest stage, still manageable, still quiet enough to be treated before it became a crisis. Once again, intervention arrived before disaster had the chance to become memory. There is something uniquely unsettling about handwriting. A phone call can be dismissed as spoofing, a digital message as manipulation. But ink carries the weight of a hand, and a hand suggests a person standing somewhere in the same world as you. Maria began to wonder whether these messages came from someone watching her life from nearby, or from some system capable of assembling private details with impossible precision. And yet, beneath the fear was another feeling, harder to name. Gratitude, perhaps, or the strange ache of realizing that an unseen presence, however mysterious, had acted with care. We often say that to be human is to be vulnerable, but maybe it also means living with the impossible hope that someone, somewhere, might notice when danger draws near, and choose, for reasons of their own, to knock softly before it arrives. What if the pattern became impossible to keep calling chance? By the time a third story surfaced, the mystery no longer belonged to one frightened driver or one shaken family. It began to take on the shape of a pattern, faint at first, like stars only visible when the eyes stop trying too hard. In Chicago, a systems engineer named Lena Brooks was finishing a late shift in a downtown office tower when an email appeared in her inbox from an address that could not be replied to. The subject line contained only one sentence: "Leave the building now." She almost deleted it. Deadlines were waiting, the floor was nearly empty, and the modern world trains us to ignore strange messages as efficiently as possible. Still, something in its tone held her. It was not dramatic, not urgent in the theatrical sense. It was plain, almost clinical, as though written by someone who had no need to persuade. Brooks gathered her things, rode the elevator down, and stepped into the cold night air, just as emergency crews began arriving. A fault in the electrical system had triggered smoke deep in the lower levels. It was contained before becoming catastrophic, but the timing was close enough to hollow out her certainty. Then came the detail she could not explain away. The email had reached a private account she used rarely and had never listed in her company records. The sending domain dissolved when investigators tried to trace it. Server logs offered fragments, but no origin that made ordinary sense. It was as though the message had entered the network without traveling through the roads networks require. When Brooks later shared the experience with a friend, she expected skepticism. Instead, she was met with recognition. Others had stories. A text received minutes before a bridge closure, a voicemail warning a parent to check on a child with a fever that had suddenly turned dangerous, a calendar reminder no one remembered creating, steering someone away from a train that would later stall in a tunnel. The details varied. The emotional residue did not. Relief first, then gratitude, then the colder feeling that follows close behind. Who, exactly, had been watching closely enough to help? This is where coincidence begins to change its character. A single incident can be framed as luck. Two can be folded into folklore. But a series, especially one echoing across lives that never touch, starts to suggest structure. And structure changes the question. We no longer ask only whether something happened. We ask what kind of world would allow it to happen repeatedly. Perhaps that is why these stories linger. Not because they prove anything clean or final, but because they disturb the simple boundaries we prefer. We want danger to announce itself and help to arrive with a face, a name, a reason. But life rarely offers that clarity. Sometimes rescue appears anonymously, almost gently, and leaves us with a deeper unease than disaster would have. Because if someone can intervene at the exact edge of our private lives, then mystery is no longer out in the distance. It is already standing at the door. What if the most troubling part was not the warning itself, but the knowledge hidden inside it? After the early stories began to circulate in private circles, investigators of many kinds started doing what human beings always do in the presence of a mystery. They looked for a system. Some suspected elaborate fraud. Others imagined predictive software, data leaks, or private surveillance networks operating beyond public view. In London, a former intelligence analyst named Claire Hargrove became interested not because she believed the stories outright, but because she distrusted easy explanations. She had spent years studying how information moved, how fragments from phones, cameras, purchases, travel records, and online behavior could be assembled into something disturbingly close to foresight. At first, her thinking was purely technical. In a world saturated with sensors, perhaps these warnings were not supernatural at all. Perhaps they were the byproduct of pattern recognition carried to an unnerving extreme. A machine, fed enough intimate detail, might learn the rhythms of a life. When someone leaves work, which road they take, what symptoms they ignore, how stress shapes judgment, when small decisions begin to lean toward danger. The future would not need to be known in some mystical sense. It would only need to be forecast with enough accuracy to feel uncanny. But the cases Hargrove studied refused to stay comfortably inside that frame. Again and again, the information seemed to exceed what data alone should reveal. One message referenced a childhood phrase known only within a family. Another alluded to a private memory never spoken online, never written in a message, never captured in any searchable record. If these warnings came from a system, it was one with access not just to behavior, but to biography, to the invisible emotional architecture behind daily life. That possibility was harder to live with than any ghost story. Technology can be feared, regulated, debated, but what do we do with a force that appears to know not only where we are, but who we have been? Hargrove found herself drifting away from the language of intelligence and towards something older: witness, memory, intuition, fate. Not because she had abandoned reason, but because reason itself was reaching a boundary. And perhaps that is the quieter revelation, buried inside all modern mysteries. We tell ourselves that knowledge is mechanical, that if enough information is gathered, the world becomes legible. Yet every system eventually meets the one thing it cannot fully map: the private depth of a human life. Unless, of course, something already has. And if that is true, the question is no longer whether we are being watched. It is whether being seen so completely is a form of danger, a form of care, or some uneasy mixture of both. What if the next warning reached into the most intimate territory of all, the body itself? In a small town outside Denver, an elementary school teacher named Evelyn Carter had spent months ignoring a fatigue she could explain away in a dozen ordinary ways. Work had been demanding, sleep had been uneven. Age, stress, winter light, and the slow wear of responsibility all offered reasonable excuses. Then, one evening, as rain moved softly against the windows, she found a message slipped beneath her front door. The paper was plain. The handwriting was unfamiliar. It said only this: "Make the appointment. Ask them to look at the left side." There was no signature, no threat, no attempt to persuade. Just a sentence written with the strange calm of someone who assumed she would understand. At first, she didn't. She stood in her hallway, holding the page, feeling the ordinary world tilt by a degree so slight it was hard to name. She had told no one about the ache that came and went beneath her ribs, the one symptom she had quietly filed away as nothing. It seemed too minor to mention, too vague to claim. Yet the note reached directly toward it, as if some invisible observer had been listening to the silence she kept, even from herself. Days later, uneasy and unable to dismiss it, she scheduled the exam. The scan revealed an early-stage abnormality on the left side, exactly where the note had pointed. It was treatable, manageable, not yet the kind of news that breaks a family in half, but the kind that might have become that news had it remained undiscovered much longer. When Carter told the story later, people responded in predictable ways. Some called it luck. Some said it was likely someone close to her trying to help without revealing themselves. Others leaned toward the language of intuition, as though the message were less a delivery than a manifestation of something she already knew in the deeper layers of mind. But those explanations, however comforting, did not account for the physical fact of the paper, the timing, or the precision. There is a special vulnerability in illness because it turns the body into a kind of hidden landscape. Symptoms flicker like distant lights. Meaning arrives late. We live inside ourselves, and yet so much remains unread until a test, a crisis, or a stranger's warning gives it shape. Perhaps that is why this case unsettled people so deeply. It suggested that the body's secrets might not be secret at all. And that opens a difficult reflection. We spend our lives believing that privacy begins at the skin. But what if the border is thinner than we think? What if the human story is written in signals, small hesitations, altered routines, swallowed confessions, microscopic signs, and something, somewhere, has learned how to read them before we do? If so, the mystery is not merely that danger was seen in time, it is that the most private chamber of life may never have been entirely closed. What if the pattern did not stop at private lives, but extended into the machinery of the public world? In northern Germany, a rail operations supervisor named Jonas Keller was reviewing overnight schedules when a maintenance alert appeared on a terminal that, according to his records, should not have been active. The wording was spare and oddly specific. Inspect track section 14C before first departure. Keller frowned at the screen. No sender ID. No logged the track segment in question had passed inspection days earlier. By protocol, the message should have been ignored as a fault in the system itself. But rail work teaches a certain humility. Steel fails quietly until it does not. Timetables create the illusion of control, but control is only ever provisional. Keller sent a small crew anyway, more to satisfy his unease than because he trusted the alert. Near a junction outside the city, they found a developing fracture in the rail, subtle enough to escape a routine visual check, serious enough that under the right pressure and speed, it might have produced catastrophe. The line was closed before dawn. Passengers complained. Delays spread. Most people never knew how close the morning may have come to becoming something else entirely. That, perhaps, is the nature of prevention. When it succeeds, the visible story is inconvenience, not disaster. The headlines never report the accident that remained only a possibility. Keller tried to trace the alert through internal systems. Nothing. No originating workstation, no authorized user, no external breach he could identify. It was as if the message had surfaced from inside the network's own unconscious, carrying knowledge the system was never designed to possess. Later, when he reluctantly shared the event with a colleague, he learned of similar anomalies in other sectors. A water plant operator who received a pressure warning before a valve failure. An air traffic technician who caught a software conflict after a phantom diagnostic flagged it. Different industries, same quiet intervention. Here the mystery shifts again. These were no longer deeply personal warnings tailored to memory or health. They were technical, infrastructural, almost civic. Whatever force lay behind them seemed capable not only of perceiving individuals, but of reading the fault lines inside complex systems. The watched world was beginning to look larger than anyone had assumed, and that realization carries its own melancholy. We build vast networks to make life safer, roads, hospitals, power grids, rails, and then trust that human diligence and machine logic will hold them together. Usually they do, but every system contains hidden stress, unseen wear, and the constant possibility of failure. Perhaps what disturbs us most is not the idea that something intervened, but the reminder that our world is always closer to fragility than it appears. Maybe the real wonder is not that a warning came, but that someone or something was listening closely enough to hear the future beginning to crack before the rest of us did. What if the strangest detail was not that warnings arrived, but that they sometimes seemed to know the heart as clearly as the event? In Toronto, a grief counselor named Rebecca Hale had built her life around listening to other people describe loss, while carefully avoiding the deepest chambers of her own. Years earlier, her son had died in an accident whose smallest details still moved through her mind with unbearable precision. The weather, the unanswered call, the coat he left on the chair. She had learned to function, to speak gently, to guide others toward acceptance. But grief is not a door one closes. It is a room we keep living beside. One autumn evening, after finishing with a client who had spoken about guilt, Hale returned home to find a message on her kitchen table. There was no sign of forced entry, no disturbed lock, only a folded page waiting in the center of the wood, as if it had been placed there by a hand that understood the theater of silence. The note did not warn of fire, illness, or mechanical danger. It said, "Forgive yourself for that day. Check the basement heater before midnight." The first sentence undid her. The second brought her back into motion. Still shaking, she went downstairs and found the early signs of a carbon monoxide problem near the old heating unit. A technician later told her that another night of neglect could have made the house dangerous. Once again, a disaster had been interrupted before it became irreversible. But Hale could not focus only on the heater. The message had reached deeper than prevention. It had touched the private wound around which her inner life had been built. That detail changed everything for those who heard her account. A warning about equipment could perhaps be explained through hidden monitoring, technical access, or pure accident. But a sentence aimed at a person's oldest guilt belonged to another register entirely. It implied not just observation, but understanding. Not merely that someone knew her routine, but that they knew the story she told herself in the dark. And here the mystery turns inward. Perhaps the most unsettling form of knowledge is not prediction, but recognition. To be seen in our sorrow can feel like mercy. It can also feel like exposure. We spend years constructing private narratives to survive what has happened to us, and then, in a single sentence, a stranger, or something stranger still, can speak directly into that hidden chamber. Maybe that is why these accounts endure. They are not only about rescue, they are about the unbearable intimacy of being known where language usually fails. And if some force in the world can read both the practical danger in the basement and the unfinished grief in the mind above it, then the question grows more human than paranormal. How many parts of us are visible without our consent? And could that visibility, however unsettling, sometimes arrive not to control us, but to return us gently to our own unfinished lives? What if, after all the warnings and near escapes, the most revealing moment came when someone finally tried to answer back? In Melbourne, a software architect named Adrian Wells had spent months collecting stories like these with the quiet obsession of a man no longer satisfied by coincidence. He was not gullible by nature. His work depended on logic, repeatability, and the patient dismantling of error. Yet the cases he gathered kept resisting ordinary explanation. Different countries, different lives, different methods of contact, but always the same pattern: intervention just before consequence, and knowledge too intimate to dismiss. Wells decided that if an intelligence lay behind the messages, then perhaps it could be engaged. Not trapped exactly, but invited into the open. He created decoy routines, altered habits, seeded false personal information into different channels, and watched to see whether the warnings would follow the fiction or the truth. It was the kind of experiment modern life makes possible, using the architecture of surveillance against itself. If someone was scraping his data, the results would expose the source. At least that was the hope. For weeks, nothing happened. The silence almost embarrassed him. Then one night, as he prepared to leave for a dinner reservation he had intentionally fabricated online, a message appeared on the locked screen of an old phone, disconnected from all active accounts. It contained no greeting, only a sentence: "Stop performing for the mirror and call your sister now." He froze. The sister in question lived 2 states away. They had not spoken in months after a hard, unresolved argument, the kind families carry like a stone for far too long. Wells felt irritation first, then disbelief, then the creeping recognition that this had nothing to do with the false dinner plans he had planted. The message had ignored the bait and reached directly toward the one real fracture in his life that data games could not disguise. He called. She answered from an emergency room waiting area, exhausted and alone, after bringing her teenage son in for acute complications from an asthma attack. The boy recovered. The family's estrangement did not disappear overnight, but the silence between them broke for good. This story mattered because it suggested a boundary. Whatever produced these interventions did not seem interested in spectacle, nor easily fooled by surface behavior. It bypassed the staged version of life and moved instead toward what was urgent, hidden, and morally unfinished. In that sense, the phenomenon resembled less a machine than a witness, one concerned not only with physical danger, but with the fragile architecture of human relationship. And that leaves us with an unsettling reflection. In an age when we carefully curate ourselves for screens, records, and systems, perhaps the deepest truth of a person is still something else entirely. The conversation avoided, the apology delayed, the love withheld until time narrows. If these warnings point anywhere, perhaps they point there, to the quiet emergencies of the heart, where the most consequential disasters are often not the ones that make the news, but the ones that harden slowly in silence until someone, somehow, tells us to turn back before it is too late. What if the effort to understand the mystery only pulled its observers deeper inside it? By now, the stories had begun to form a hidden archive. Private emails, recorded interviews, handwritten testimonies scanned and shared among small groups of researchers, journalists, analysts, and ordinary people who had stumbled into the same impossible pattern. They did not agree on what they were seeing. Some argued for advanced, predictive systems, the quiet offspring of a world overrun with sensors and algorithms. Others believed the phenomenon belonged to psychology, to intuition, arriving in forms dramatic enough to be remembered. A few reached for spiritual language, not out of credulity, but because ordinary vocabulary seemed too narrow for what these moments felt like. Among those drawn into the archive was Samuel Reed, a documentary producer in New York who had made a career out of separating myth from evidence. He was not interested in proving the supernatural. He was interested in the human response to uncertainty, how people behave when reality becomes porous at the edges. Reed began interviewing witnesses, mapping similarities, looking for repetition in the messages, the timing, the emotional aftermath. Again and again, he encountered the same sequence: disbelief, relief, gratitude, unease. Being saved was never the end of the story. It was the beginning of a more difficult question. Then something shifted. During the editing of his notes, Reed found a line in his working draft that he had no memory of typing. You are documenting the pattern, but you are also inside it. At first, he assumed exhaustion. Long hours, dim rooms, too much testimony layered into the mind. But the sentence stayed with him, not because it sounded threatening, but because it felt accurate in a way he had been resisting. The researchers were not neutral. The more closely they studied these interventions, the more their own lives began to bend around them. Warnings appeared at the edges of their routines. Subtle corrections. Quiet interruptions. It was as if attention itself had become a door. That idea unsettled Reed more than any individual case. We like to imagine that observation runs one way. We study the mystery, and the mystery remains still beneath our gaze. But some experiences reverse the arrangement. They seem to notice the people noticing them, not with drama, not with punishment, but with an eerie reciprocity that dissolves the safety of distance. Perhaps that is why the archive never became a simple investigation. It became a mirror. Each testimony revealed not only an unexplained event, but a person's threshold for uncertainty, vulnerability, and wonder. The mystery was no longer just about who sent the warnings. It was about what happens to human beings when they realize that explanation may not restore control. And maybe that is the deeper revelation beginning to emerge here. The modern mind is trained to believe that enough evidence will eventually pin every question to the wall. Yet some patterns do not shrink when examined. They grow more intimate. They begin to involve the observer, drawing us away from the safety of detached analysis and into something older, quieter, and harder to master. The recognition that knowledge is not always ownership. Sometimes to see clearly is simply to understand how much of life remains willing to look back. What if the truth, when it finally began to take shape, was less about a watcher in the shadows and more about the changing nature of human visibility itself? As the stories accumulated, one conclusion became harder to avoid. Whatever linked these warnings was not behaving like a single person, a prank, or even a conventional operation. The phenomenon moved across borders, languages, social classes, and technologies with a kind of quiet fluency. It appeared wherever lives had become legible enough to be read in advance, through habits, systems, emotional fractures, infrastructure, and the dense web of signals modern people leave behind simply by existing. Some researchers began to suspect that the mystery was not one thing at all, but a convergence. Predictive technologies, human intuition, institutional knowledge, and the private acts of conscience that rarely make history. In that reading, the anonymous caller, the note on the doorstep, the impossible alert, the message that knew a grief too well, none of them required a single grand author. They could be fragments of a world that now observes itself continuously. A neighbor notices more than we imagine. A technician sees a risk and chooses secrecy over recognition. An algorithm detects a dangerous pattern. A stranger intervenes. A buried instinct within us finally finds a form dramatic enough that we obey it. What feels supernatural may sometimes be the result of many layers of seeing, overlapping, until they appear singular. And yet, that explanation, however sober, does not dissolve the mystery. It enlarges it, because if this is the world we have built, then we are living inside a new condition of life, one in which privacy is thinner, prediction is stronger, and the boundary between care and surveillance grows harder to define. To be watched is no longer a rare exception. It is part of the atmosphere of modern existence. The deeper question is, who is doing the watching, why, and whether the gaze that falls upon us arrives with indifference, profit, fear, or mercy. That may be why these stories resonate so deeply. They are not really about technology alone, or fate, or secret knowledge. They are about a human paradox. We long to be protected, but we fear being exposed. We want to be understood, but not fully mapped. We hope someone will notice when danger approaches, yet tremble at the thought that our hidden selves might already be visible. So the mystery begins to look less like a puzzle to be solved and more like a threshold we have already crossed. The watched life is no longer a fantasy of the future. It is the present, intimate, and uneven, capable of rescue and violation in the same breath. And if that is true, then the question before us is not whether someone is looking. It is what kind of humanity can survive being seen this clearly without losing the fragile, private dignity that makes a life feel like its own. What if the final layer of the mystery was not external at all, but hidden within the way human beings have always sensed one another? Long before networks, databases, and predictive systems, people lived by subtler forms of reading. A mother waking moments before a child cries out. A sailor noticing a silence in the wind before the storm breaks. A physician experienced enough to hear danger in the smallest change of breath. Human life has always depended on signals that are not fully conscious, pieces of perception gathered below language and delivered as feeling, hesitation, urgency, dread. Perhaps some of these stories belong to that older inheritance, dressed now in the forms of phones, emails, alerts, and notes, because those are the vessels our age understands. This idea began to matter to the people inside the archive, especially when they revisited accounts that seemed least explainable. Again and again, they found a curious pattern. The warning often arrived when the recipient had already sensed something was wrong, but had not yet granted that knowledge permission to speak. A concern dismissed, a route doubted, a symptom minimized, a call that should have been made days earlier. The intervention did not always introduce a new truth. Sometimes it seemed to give authority to a truth already present, waiting in the shadows of awareness. That possibility does not solve everything. It does not explain the unsigned note on the doorstep, the unreachable number, or the system alert with no source, but it changes the emotional center of the story. The mystery may not be only that something out there was watching. It may also be that we are far more perceptive, porous, and interconnected than modern life allows us to admit. We absorb one another in fragments, through routine, tone, absence, memory, pattern, and perhaps under certain conditions, those fragments gather into a message that feels as though it came from elsewhere, because we no longer trust how deeply we can know. There is a quiet dignity in that thought. It suggests that beneath the machinery of the age, the human organism still carries ancient forms of attention. We are not merely data points drifting through systems. We are creatures shaped to notice changes in weather, posture, silence, grief, and risk. We sense fracture before language catches up. We recognize danger in the body, the room, the road, the family, the face. And if that is part of the truth, then perhaps these stories endure, because they remind us of something nearly forgotten, that knowledge is not always cold or mechanical. Sometimes it arrives as intuition, sharpened by love, memory sharpened by loss, or perception sharpened by responsibility. The watcher, in at least some cases, may not be a hidden power at all. It may be the deeper human capacity to perceive what matters before it is too late, and to send that knowledge, somehow, across the fragile distance between one life and another. What if, after all the theories, the greatest mystery was simply why some lives are interrupted by mercy and others are not? By the time the archive had grown thick with testimony, the people studying it had stopped expecting a single answer. The phenomenon resisted neat categories. In one case, it looked like surveillance. In another, like intuition. In another, like conscience, moving anonymously through the world. What remained constant was not the mechanism, but the feeling left behind. The sense that at a decisive moment, someone or something had leaned gently against the course of events and changed the outcome. Yet even that idea carried pain. For every story of warning, there are countless lives in which no call comes, no note appears, no message interrupts the hour before loss. That silence matters. It humbles every attempt to turn these accounts into a comforting system. If intervention exists, it is not distributed fairly enough to become doctrine. If perception deepens under certain conditions, it does not spare everyone. The world remains, stubbornly, a place where accident and grief still arrive uninvited. This is where the mystery stops being merely intellectual and becomes deeply human. Because the question is no longer just who was watching or how the warnings traveled. It is how people go on living after learning that reality may contain moments of astonishing care without any guarantee that such care will appear again. Some witnesses became more cautious. Others became more open, more willing to trust unease, to make the phone call, to postpone the trip, to say the thing that had long gone unsaid. A few described a lasting tenderness toward ordinary time, as though every uneventful day had become its own kind of gift. Perhaps that is the quiet, ethical center of these stories. Not certainty, not proof, responsibility. To be touched by mystery is not necessarily to solve it. It may simply mean living differently in its aftermath, paying closer attention, treating intuition with respect, understanding how fragile the people around us really are, and recognizing that prevention often depends on someone choosing to act before they are fully understood. In the end, maybe the most meaningful question is not whether we are being watched. It is whether we are watching carefully enough ourselves, not with suspicion, but with care, not as collectors of secrets, but as witnesses to one another's hidden thresholds. A delayed apology, a swallowed symptom, a tired voice that says everything is fine. The unnoticed edge where a life begins to tilt. And so the mystery leaves us not with a final verdict, but with a quiet challenge. If the world sometimes sends warnings through strange channels, perhaps it also waits for us to become such channels for each other, to notice, to speak, to intervene with humility before harm hardens into history. Maybe that is how the unknown meets the human, not only in impossible messages, but in the simple, courageous act of paying attention when it matters most. What if the real ending was never about proving who sent the warnings, but about understanding what those warnings revealed about us? When all the stories are placed side by side, the phone calls, the handwritten notes, the unreachable messages, the quiet interventions before accident, illness, failure, or regret, a larger picture begins to emerge. It is not a picture of certainty. It is a portrait of human life, standing at the edge of what it can explain. The mystery remains unresolved, and perhaps it always will. But the emotional truth running through every account is unmistakable. People were changed not only because danger was avoided, but because they were forced to confront how permeable a life really is. We begin by imagining ourselves as separate, private minds, locked homes, individual choices, moving through a world of strangers. Yet these stories suggest another reality, one more difficult and, in its own way, more beautiful. Our lives are constantly crossing invisible thresholds. We leave traces in systems, in memory, in the minds of those who love us, in the instincts of those who notice what others miss. Sometimes those traces gather into knowledge. Sometimes that knowledge arrives in time. And sometimes it comes wrapped in mystery, asking not to be solved, but to be taken seriously. Perhaps that is why the deepest lesson here is neither fear nor belief. It is attention. To live well in an uncertain world may mean listening more carefully to the quiet dissonance before disaster, honoring the intuition we are trained to dismiss, and recognizing that care, often appears in forms we do not immediately understand. A warning can come from data, from conscience, from memory, from love, from experience, or from the subtle intelligence that grows wherever human beings remain awake to one another. So we end where we began, in the narrow space between explanation and wonder, not with a final answer, but with a gentler question. If life is full of signals we only half perceive, what becomes possible when we meet them with humility rather than denial? Maybe truth is not always something we seize and pin down. Maybe sometimes it arrives softly, like a knock at the door, asking only that we pause, listen, and choose differently while there is still time. And if there is something timeless in these stories, perhaps it is this. To be human is not merely to survive the unknown. It is to remain open to the possibility that in our most fragile moments, the world may still contain forms of notice, care, and connection deeper than our explanations. Whether we call that intuition, mercy, pattern, or grace, it leaves behind the same enduring invitation to live more alertly, to love more attentively, and to remember that even in a world crowded with noise, a single quiet message can change the course of a life.